afternoon. I'm faced almost every day in my life with what I call a follow that moment, and introductions like that tend to be follow that moments, really. My work as Children's Commissioner, it has been the best job I've ever done in my life. It's also been the scariest, the loneliest and the most under attack. I'm not permitted to reapply for the post, and my term ends on the 28th of February next year. So they're in the middle of appointing my successor while I try and carry on, which is also an interesting place to be. When I was a teacher, I taught in very truly comprehensive schools, and therefore, as a very ordinary class teacher in entirely mixed ability settings, with support that came into my classroom rather than children going somewhere else, it feels to me as if I have lived all of my professional life with children and young people with a very wide range of difficulties, challenges, but also great gifts and talents that they brought into those very mixed classrooms on a daily basis. A little bit of background. I'm from a very ordinary working class northern family. I was born in a mining village in South Yorkshire and have a complete and lifelong memory of growing up alongside youngsters with a very wide range of difficulties, not least because my mother's younger sister had Down syndrome. And she wasn't a very high-functioning individual in terms of the fact that she never really learnt to count or to appreciate money or to appreciate strangers, sometimes friends and sometimes not. And she was the life and soul of our family, which, considering we're a bit rambunctious as a family, was quite some difficulty, really, for her to be the life and soul when everybody else was plugging for it. As Children's Commissioner has just been said, it's my duty to promote and protect the rights of the child. If you don't already know the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, we are a ratifying state party of this international treaty. There is only one nation in the world that is still holding out not to sign the United Nations Convention, which makes it the most signed human rights document on the planet. We signed it under John Major's government in 1991. And as a treaty, it's 25 years old this year. In fact, it's only about a month from its 25th birthday. So you may see, cropping up all over the place, conversations with children and young people about what the balance is in their lives between their rights, and they are rights holders. They don't have to earn them. They don't have to get stickers on a star chart. They don't have to be in anybody's good books. They are born holding these rights, which makes you and I duty bearers. I'll just let that sink in a minute. You and I, for every child in this country, are duty bearers. And I'll talk about duty bearing in a minute when I talk about our report. UNICEF publishes very handy summaries. You can get them hard copy on A3, or you can download them from the website on A4. The Convention is a very important document. It is as important in my work as the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where we were hoping that the UK government was going to be held to account almost as I'm standing here. And somehow it's gone into the long grass somewhere, the current interrogation of the UK government on the UN CRPD. But don't forget it, because we haven't, and we are continuing to push hard on where it's at and why it's not being interrogated now and when it is going to be and what do we have to say about it. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the one signatory nation that ought to be a signatory and isn't, is the United States of America. Everybody else has signed it. However, signing it and living by it are two very different things. The Convention has clusters of articles, some of which are very general. So you have a right to have your name registered formally and with the state in which you live. You have the right to carry a birth certificate. You have the right to worship in a faith that you want to follow with no discrimination being aimed at you because of it. You have a right to nurture and safety, to stay with your family as long as it's safe, to see both parents if your parents separate as long as it's safe. But there are some very important and central articles which feature in the report that's just been mentioned, and I'll come on to that in a minute, which you should never forget. If you are working with a parent of, a teacher of, a medic working with, an advocate for, or running a charity to do with children with any sorts of difficulties or disabilities, what are called the general principles of implementation within the Convention are absolutely central to what you do. So, quick cook's tour. Article 2 says, if you are under 18 and you live in or are a citizen of a state party, the convention applies to you in its entirety. Nobody can say, well, you can have rights 1, 9, 16, 24, and on a good day 48, but you can't have the others. They are all yours. You were born with them, and they cannot be taken away from you. If you commit a crime, if you are abandoned, if your family divides, if you have a disability, if you are sick, if you are dying, if you are an absolute star and likely to go on to be next Prime Minister, nobody can take those rights away from you. Now, that's profound in a society that believes, actually, that children are a nuisance. Well, actually, that's not quite so. They're fine until they're 11. And then, of course, they become feral in the summer holidays between leaving primary school and going to secondary school. I'm going to try my question test. Are any of your children feral? I am guessing not. Are any of your friends' children feral? Right, so that's quite a lot of people off the list. Are any of your family's children feral? Can you see where I'm going with this? Are any of you parents of teenage children with disabilities who quite like the chance? That's gone quiet, hasn't it? Yeah. To be wild, to be naughty, to be a teenager, to be really, really, really rebellious, horrible, and stay out all night. Are you going to let them? Thought it might go quiet at that point. What teenagers with disabilities talk to me about all the time is, I want you to see me as the potentially snotty, nasty, grumpy teenager that I'd quite like to be. Not just the child with the disability that you see when I walk or come on my wheels through the door. I want to be able to be as rebellious as my able-bodied and intellectually more capable peers. So I'm just going to lob that bomb into your fish pond if what you're doing is buying the next supply of cotton wool. Not all children with disabilities are safe in themselves or able to be that rebellious, stay out all night, go to Glastonbury if I like, you can't stop me, teenager. But some of them are. And quite large numbers of them. I have 3 or 4 disabled youngsters on my 11 to 18-year-old board who are as rambunctious and likely to stay up all night and run round the outdoor centre banging on everybody's doors as anybody else is. And that's fine, because they're adolescents. And it's really important, and many of the youngsters who help with this piece of research would tell you, if they were here, that they consider it really important that they're seen as the person first and the disability about 10th on the list. And that's a real challenge. It's a challenge for schools, it's a challenge for medics, it can sometimes be a challenge for family members, it's certainly a challenge for society. And there are some wonderful pieces of YouTube film of youngsters in marketplaces like Preston who are being seen by the people who are wandering through that town as wheelchair first, person second, third, fourth, ninth. And if there's anything about the fight for equality that we ought to be able, surely to goodness, in the 21st century to achieve, is that you see the person first. That you ask society to see the person first and their potential and their abilities. And that's what the Convention is pressing for. So Article 6 says, every child has the entitlement to be brought into a society that will develop them to their fullest possible potential, whatever that potential might be. These are challenging articles. These are not articles of law, but this is an international treaty, and we must have meant it when we signed it. And it's as much an international treaty as the ones that end wars or stop nuclear testing. It's a treaty. So if we meant it, one of the things that you are armed with is to say, the United Nations Convention says my child is entitled to this. You can't fob us off. You can't tell us no. You may be able to help us to adjust our expectations, but what you can't do is a blanket no. Here's another one that some parents find challenging. I certainly found it challenging with my stepchildren when they were teenagers. Article 12 says you have the right, in accordance with your age and stage of maturity, to have your voice not only heard but taken seriously in every decision that's made about your life. So as a former director of children's services, I did have fairly difficult conversations with parents who were saying things like, well, he needs a taxi. And the child going, I don't. I want the money for a bus fare and a buddy on the bus. And the parent going, no, you'll die if you don't have a taxi. And the child going, mother, will you stop it? Because when I leave school, I won't have one, and I've got to get used to using public transport. The money will probably be the same, because if you're going to pay a buddy, they'll have to be CRB checked and properly escort trained. It's not just my mate from sixth form who plays in the same PE team as I do, or bocce or whatever. This is serious stuff. I want somebody who may be my age, but I want to learn to use independent transport. And his mother was, by this point, kind of fanning herself. And I said, let's just do it on a trial basis. And we did it on a trial basis. And she had the grace and the generosity of spirit to come back to me 6 months later and say, he was right, and so were you. He's a happier, more rounded, more confident, more adult individual, and he will leave school able to go to college because we trusted him and his need for a different sort of set of wheels from the taxi turning up at my back garden gate and taking him to school every day. That's real generosity of spirit, and I think she probably sat with her heart in her mouth for the first however many weeks of him using his buddy system and the money that way. But that's what Article 12 means. If they come to you, and what they do either through an advocate or through signs and symbols or through signing or through touch keyboards or because they can speak or whatever they use, and they express an opinion about their lives, even if you do know best, and you might, because you're older and you're wiser and you're cleverer and all of those things, listening to their opinion and taking them seriously is desperately important, and it's enshrined in the Convention under Article 12. In disability terms, Article 23 is the really big one. Article 23 says a child with any degree of difficulty or disability has a right to live in a society that will develop them to their fullest potential and provide adaptations and services that are fitted to their needs. In the new world of the education, care and in the new world of the education, care and health plan, Article 23 sits at the heart of trying to get us to the point where instead of spending half your life in a very long queue for a very short statement and 5 hours of extra support, because I remember that as well, what you are doing is with every service around that child, and you as an equal partner and the child at the table as well, in a really good EHC plan, that's how it should be formulated. And the child's mental and emotional health and well-being needs should be taken into account alongside whatever their presenting difficulties and disabilities might be. There's a battle won, because apparently you can't be both learning disabled and mentally ill, or physically disabled and mentally ill, when actually you and I know you can. How long have we been fighting that battle? The EHC plans make mental health and well-being one of the protected characteristics, one of the categories of needs. But it's a change now. What people respond to in terms of changes, we've never done it like that, or we've always done it like that, at which point discussion can sometimes stop. As a former director, I'm here to tell you that statements were never the ideal way of dealing with and providing additional support to children with difficulties and disabilities. They were ponderous, they were bureaucratic, they were divisive. You very rarely got exactly what you needed or wanted. The opportunity for you to be the driver of a statementing process was far less than it is potentially under EHC plans. But it's going to be about getting them right, and it's going to be about not using them simply to save money. And that's your challenge if you work with or for or are in a family which has a disabled child or a child with extreme difficulties. Because the buck passing will continue to be tried, I'm telling you now. Because they're under such pressure, they've lost so much money. The department I was director in has lost 45% of its revenue since I left in 2010. And there's more to come. There is no pot of gold, there is no rainbow, so they are going to have to get creative with you and the families concerned and the children concerned to get this right. And some sacred cows will no doubt die in the process. The report that was mentioned in the introduction to me is called We Want to Help People See Things Our Way, and it's on my website. I apologise now for the appalling navigability of my website. We are designing a new one, and it will be launched before Christmas. You'll be able to find what you're looking for, which is a real breakthrough. It took me 20 minutes to find this. The difference between this and other pieces of work, because there are 3 pillars in my work, always. The first pillar is, what does the law and the EU conventions and the UN and everybody else promise is an entitlement? The second is, what does the research and the literature and the media and everything we can possibly get our hands on to read tell you about the gap between the promise and the reality? And the third thing that makes us a unique organisation is what is coming straight from the voice of the child to inform both what the law says and our critique of what the law says. We want to help people see things our way. We gave the research contract to the University of Central Lancashire. And they have a very strong children's rights thread to what they do. So the authors of this report, there are half a dozen adults led by Professor Nigel Thomas, but there are then Zach, David, William, Azra, Ellie, Daniel, Reese, Rosie, Lisa, Naomi and Hans, all of whom are children with disabilities. 2 of them are now on my board because they were amazing. And the University of Central Lancashire trained them to be researchers, and I mean formally trained them. How do you ask a question? How do you wait for the answer? If you're not getting an answer, how do you ask another question that will pull that answer out of the person you're looking for? Many of these children, when we first met them, were relatively unconfident. There were one of the boys who's now on my board has quite severe autism and gets himself into a kind of wound up state about Godzilla all the time. But this work, being trained to ask questions and work out how you capture the answers, being trained then to talk about what you're finding out by talking to people, changed how they were as young people, changed their confidence. They came down to London and met their MPs. We took them into the House of Commons and they met the Health Select Committee chair. You know, I mean, these children and young people were empowered by becoming people who were asking the questions for themselves. They chose the title of the report, and what it concentrates on is not only disability, but the double whammy of disability when it sits alongside your family having too little money to make ends meet. So it talks about what the children's rights remit of my office and a children's rights approach to disability might look like. So what are your rights? To a place in a school that treats you with respect, to health that's available when you need it, to replacements for things that guard your dignity, like incontinence supplies, to a chair that you don't outgrow before you've got the wheels dirty, to a walking frame that supports you and the way you balance rather than just is a standard piece of equipment that doesn't, to a society that listens to your views even if it takes you a long time to express them. It's all in here. The double whammy situation, however, is that what they were telling us, and some of the people that they interviewed are quoted in this report, what they were telling us was that disability is expensive. Disability is expensive in terms of childcare, in terms of transport, in terms of heating, the use of water, the amount of power you have to use, the things you have to buy from the chemists, the things that are specialists and nobody else can provide. It goes on and on and on. And you will know this, I've no doubt, from vivid personal experience, either in your own families or the families you work with and support. So, quote from the parent of a very worried young person: "The house is so damp, when I'm out of here, then they'll do it. They'll bulldoze it, they'll condemn it. I am losing about £100 a week, what with gas payments and heating debt being paid off on a prepayment meter because that's what I can afford. That's just so that I can have it on morning and night for enough hot water." Quote from a 20-year-old who says, "I don't get a lot of money, I do get DLA, but at this moment, until my next cheque comes, I don't have any money for food." Care leaver as well as disabled. and therefore with nobody. I mean, it was, if I, as a 24-year-old, needed something, I used to ring my dad. Have you got a recipe for this? Have you got anything like this in your shed? Can I borrow this? Can I come for a meal? If you're a care leaver, disabled or otherwise, you haven't got any of that to fall back on. If you're a care leaver and you have a disability, and this young man was autistic and found it very difficult to interact with the world, he would sit and just be hungry rather than necessarily knowing who to reach out to and who to ask, because he just didn't. He didn't have the social skills. 18-year-old, I know my mum's really stressed. I know I'm a worry. I know I'm a burden on my family. I'd just like to think maybe just one day I can support myself and live entirely on my own. Same young man's mother interviewed, he will always be with me because I'm not going to let anybody else look after him, and why would I want to let him go and live on his own? There are some interesting conversations going on in that household, I have no doubt. He wants what his peers want. Whether or not he's able to do it is the point at which the debate begins, I think. What these families were telling us were things like just ordinary everyday things like the health supplies will allow you 4 incontinence pads for your incontinent 14-year-old. They are poor quality, they don't do the job, so you go out and supplement that supply because your 14-year-old is also post-pubertal young woman, and there are all sorts of other things going on in her life that we don't need to talk about. What the family's burden is, therefore, is double and triple the burden of the 14-year-old's family that lives next door on the same council estate, and they go to the same school. The burden on that mum is enormous, and it drives her to the point where it was probably all she could talk about in this interview was that issue. And what is that about? It's about the rights and the dignity of the child becoming a young adult in a community that will already tease her because of her disability the minute anybody's back is turned, because that's what happens, being further made undignified and further losing her empowerment and her sense of self because of a simple thing like insufficient incontinence supplies, and when you do get them, them being of very poor quality. If you're a health professional and you work in that area, there are things that clinical commissioning groups and others need to really take on board here. Families who are already poor and living on benefits do not need to have the further weight of, do we eat properly or do I safeguard my daughter's dignity? It's a rights issue. And if it was happening in your own family, you would be as worried as I would be if it was happening in mine. This is what the young people said they wanted. At the end of all this work, and University of Central Lancashire, I take my hat off to them, they did a fantastic job with these young people. What they said they wanted was that the nation should set its budgets to give greater priority to ensuring disabled children and young people have just the basic things they need for living. They're not asking for an elephant on a stick, these kids. They want what everybody else wants. They want that the nation ensures that plans for all social security reforms and all benefit level reforms are set only after listening and giving due weight to the views of disabled children and young people and their families. They want everybody to be able to access specialist education services across the country. None of them said, we want everybody to go to a special school. They were interested in what the services were going to do, not the building or the separate place. They were interested in the services. And we did test them on this. And some were in mainstream and some were in special schools. And some had been in both. And some were moving between the two. And some were about to go to a specialist college. And some were just going to go down to the FE college at the end of the road. They were all much more fixated on what the services were that they received to help them to be educated than they were in fighting a battle about separate provision. I found that really interesting because these are all adolescents and they all had something to say about that. They were very keen indeed on a resurgence in really high quality short break provision. They all had had experience as younger children of the Aim Higher for Disabled Children programme, which was around when I was a director and was about to die a year later, whoever had got into government. I'll just say that again. It was about to die a year later, whoever had got into government. It was already in the plans, as was the end of really good children's centre services, as was all sorts of stuff. So whoever had got in 2010, we would have had an austerity climate in some of the very services that these very vulnerable children need. They want better speed, better accomplishment, better flexibility, better approaches to the adaptation of housing, both for their families when they are still children and for themselves as independent young people who want the opportunity to live in their own supported or other accommodation. They want better provision, and this is another article in the Convention, Article 31, which is the right to leisure, relaxation, play, culture. They want better access to really good youth clubs that are not separate, but that actually have the sense to know that it takes quite a wide turning circle to turn a young adult's wheelchair around, and not to put them into a little back room somewhere where they can't do that. They can either go in forwards and come out backwards, or go in backwards and come out forwards. We had a lot of that in here as well, that space is not properly adapted. They want better support, advice and training for disabled children and young people and their families and any adult who is working with them, to make sure that people understand where personal assistance is needed and where it's not, where you're not having awkward and embarrassing conversations about how do I help you in and out of this, how do I help you on and off of this, do you need me to come into that space with you and help you to do whatever it is you need to do, or do you not? They want the right training for every teacher, every nurse and doctor, every social worker, because as one of them said to me, you never know when you're going to meet one of me. In your career, you never know. And I thought, that's true. They also want, in just the same way as children leaving care get, they want adolescent children with any degree of disability or difficulty to at least be able to call on personal assistance. Not live in 24/7 unless their disability is such that that's necessary, but the possibility of somebody who's not family, not school, not doctor, not nurse, not social worker, but, you know, the kind of learning mentor job or the PE assistant job that you see in some schools, that sort of person who's somewhere on their wavelength. We recommended an independent review of the adequacy of support for disabled children and young people because we consider it profoundly inadequate. More and more children and young people with a very wide range of extremely complex disabilities and needs is surviving beyond birth, beyond the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome, beyond you name it, and they're surviving. Beyond very early birth when their brains are still white matter and there won't be a great deal of grey. Beyond all of those things, our survival rates, thanks to our fantastic medical profession, have gone through the roof. They will walk through the door of your school, your youth club, your social work centre and anywhere else you happen to work at some point in their lives. And you need an understanding of how well you can support them as a society. If the government accepts the Equalities and Human Rights Commission's recommendation to establish a new strategic advisory group on disability, we consider that that should be pushed through at all speed and with a fair head of steam behind it, because actually advocacy is needed. We consider that this is a whole government agenda, that the Ministry of Defence is as likely to have children on its bases with a range of disabilities as any other department of government, and that they all need to get with the agenda. This report is a year old. We've had a fairly thin response from government so far, but the beauty of my role is that if I tell you something, you have to tell me what you're going to do about it. If you're a statutory body and I'm not satisfied with your response, I will come back and ask you again. Because we continue to work with the disability action groups, because they were one of the groups of people who've now helped to put a film together for the European meeting of people who do my job, which is in 10 days' time, and it will feature front and centre, we know that this battle isn't over. We also know that rights organisations like mine have to join our voices with organisations like yours and the children concerned, because battles like this are not easily won. It is very easy indeed to ignore the vulnerable and the marginalised and the people who are not wandering about with millions of pounds in their pockets. It is a travesty that it's easy to do that ignoring, and it's something that we don't have to lie down and take. and neither do they. I'm staying for questions and answers. I've overrun my time, so now I'm going to get off the stage. Thank you very much.